The cellar door slammed shut before Margaret could speak a single word in her own defense. Darkness swallowed her whole. The cold stone beneath her feet seeped through her thin shoes, and somewhere above her head she could hear Lady Constance's voice, sharp and satisfied, giving instructions to a servant as though she were discussing the weather rather than locking a grieving widow away like a criminal. "Leave her there until my brother returns," Constance said. "Perhaps a night in the dark will loosen her tongue." Margaret pressed her palm against the door, but it did not move. She was not a woman given to panic, not anymore, not after everything she had already survived, but the sound of the bolt sliding into place sent a tremor through her chest that she could not control. She had come to Blackthorn Hall with nothing but a small trunk and a heart already broken beyond repair. She had not expected kindness. She had not expected comfort, but she had not expected this either. 3 days earlier, Margaret had stood at the gates of the estate with her trunk beside her and her hands folded tightly in front of her, rehearsing the words she would say to the family of her late husband. Her husband, Edmund Ashworth, had died 6 months before, leaving behind a modest fortune that a distant cousin had claimed through a legal maneuver Margaret barely understood. She had been left with almost nothing. No home, no income, no family of her own left to turn to. The only connection she had left in the world was the family her husband had once belonged to before his falling out with them years ago, a falling out that had never been fully explained to her. She had written a single letter to the Duke of Ravensworth, a man she had never met, asking only for temporary shelter while she found her footing. She had expected a refusal, or at best a cold, formal welcome. What she received instead was silence, followed by an invitation delivered not by the Duke himself, who was away on business in the north, but by his sister, Lady Constance. From the very first moment Margaret arrived, she understood that Constance did not want her there. Constance was a striking woman, tall and elegant, with a voice that could cut through a room like a blade wrapped in silk. She received Margaret in the drawing-room with a smile so thin it barely qualified as one at all, her eyes moving over Margaret's worn traveling dress with an expression that made Margaret feel smaller than she already did. "So you are the widow," Constance had said, as though the word itself were something distasteful. "My brother is generous to a fault. I hope you understand that this is a temporary arrangement." "I understand completely," Margaret had replied, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation curling in her stomach. "I have no intention of overstaying my welcome." "See that you don't." The days that followed were an exercise in quiet endurance. Margaret kept to herself, taking her meals in her room whenever she could manage it, avoiding the family gatherings where Constance's sharp remarks seemed to find her no matter where she sat. The servants were kind enough, though careful, watching her with the wary curiosity people reserve for outsiders who might not be staying long. One young maid, Eleanor, had shown her small kindnesses: a warm cup of tea left outside her door, a spare blanket when the nights grew cold, gestures that meant more to Margaret than Eleanor could possibly know. Margaret spent her mornings walking the grounds, partly to avoid the house, and partly because the fresh air was the only thing that seemed to ease the tightness in her chest. She would walk past the gardens, past the old stone fountain that no longer worked, past the long row of oak trees that lined the eastern edge of the property, and she would think about her daughter. No one at Blackthorn Hall knew about her daughter. No one knew that Margaret had given birth to a little girl 4 years ago, a girl with dark curls and a laugh that used to fill their small home with light, a girl who had lived only 14 months before a sudden illness took her in the space of a single terrible week. Margaret had never spoken of it to anyone since. The grief was hers alone to carry, folded up small and tucked away where no one could reach it, except for the nights when it rose up anyway, uninvited, and left her staring at the ceiling until dawn. She kept one small portrait of her daughter, painted by a traveling artist when the child was only a few months old. It was the only image she had, the only proof that her daughter had ever existed at all, and she carried it with her everywhere, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth and tucked inside the lining of her trunk where no curious eyes would find it. It was that very portrait that would soon bring her more trouble than she could have imagined. On the third evening of her stay, a commotion broke out in the east wing of the house. A piece of jewelry belonging to Constance, an emerald brooch that had belonged to their late mother, had gone missing from her dressing table. The household was thrown into an uproar. Servants were questioned one by one, rooms were searched, and voices rose and fell throughout the corridors as accusations began to fly. Margaret had nothing to do with it. She had barely left her room that day, occupied with mending the hem of her only good dress, and trying to distract herself from thoughts of home, of the life she used to have, of the daughter she had lost. But when Constance stormed into the drawing-room that evening, her eyes sweeping over the gathered household with barely restrained fury, her gaze landed on Margaret and did not move away. "You," Constance said, "you are the only one in this house who does not belong here, the only one with no history, no reputation to protect. Tell me, widow, what have you done with my mother's brooch?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "I have not touched your brooch, my lady. I have not even seen it." Convenient, isn't it, that the moment a stranger arrives in this house, something valuable disappears? "I swear to you, I have done nothing wrong." Constance's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, her presence looming even though she was not a particularly tall woman, her voice dropping into something quieter and far more dangerous than her earlier shouting. "You swear? A widow with no fortune, no family, and no proof of anything she claims, swears to me that she is innocent. Forgive me if I do not find that entirely convincing." The rest of the household stood frozen, none of them willing to intervene, none of them willing to defend a woman they barely knew against the sister of the Duke himself. Margaret searched their faces for any sign of support and found none, only downcast eyes and uncomfortable silence. Eleanor, standing near the door with a tray still in her hands, looked as though she wanted to speak but did not dare. "Search her room," Constance commanded, turning to the nearest footman. "Search her belongings, and if the brooch is not found within the hour, we shall have no choice but to assume the worst." The search turned up nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. But rather than easing Constance's suspicion, the empty search seemed only to inflame it further. She paced the length of the drawing-room, her skirts snapping against the floor with each sharp turn, muttering about clever thieves who knew how to hide their tracks. "My lady," Margaret said, forcing herself to remain calm even as her heart hammered against her ribs, "I understand your jewelry is missing, and I understand your concern. But I promise you, on everything I have left in this world, that I have not taken anything from you." "On everything you have left," Constance repeated, a cold smile touching her lips. "How very little that must be." The cruelty of the words landed harder than Margaret expected, striking at the very heart of everything she had already lost: her husband, her home, her daughter, her place in the world. She said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say that would change the mind of a woman who had already decided her guilt before a single question had been asked. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Constance made her decision. She gathered 2 of the household staff, her expression set and unyielding, and gave the order that would change everything. "Take her to the cellar," she said. "Lock the door. Perhaps a night alone in the dark will remind her that honesty is easier than deceit." "My lady, surely there is no need," Eleanor began, her voice trembling with a courage that clearly cost her a great deal to summon. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Constance snapped, and Eleanor fell silent immediately, her eyes dropping to the floor. Margaret did not resist as the footman led her toward the cellar stairs. There was no point in resisting. She had learned, over the past difficult months, that fighting against forces larger than herself only exhausted her further, and she needed whatever strength she had left simply to survive the night ahead. She held her head high as she walked, refusing to let Constance see her break, even as her thoughts spun with fear and disbelief at how quickly her circumstances had turned. Before she was led away, she managed one small act of foresight. She reached into her trunk, still open from the earlier search, and slipped the small wrapped portrait of her daughter into the pocket of her dress. She did not know why she did it. Perhaps she simply could not bear the thought of being separated from the one thing that connected her to her child, especially not now, not when everything else in her life felt as though it were being stripped away piece by piece. The cellar was cold and smelled of damp stone and old wood. A single narrow window near the ceiling let in a thin sliver of moonlight, barely enough to see by. Margaret found an old wooden crate near the wall and lowered herself onto it, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. She sat there for a long while in silence, listening to the faint sounds of the house above her, footsteps crossing floors, distant voices, the closing of doors. She thought about how far she had fallen in such a short time. She thought about her husband, about the life they had built together before illness and misfortune tore it apart. She thought about her daughter, about the weight of a small body in her arms, about a laugh she would never hear again. She reached into her pocket and drew out the small wrapped portrait, unfolding the cloth with careful, practiced hands. In the dim moonlight, she could just make out the soft curve of her daughter's cheek, the dark curls painted with such tenderness by the artist who had captured her for the only time in her short life. "I am sorry," Margaret whispered to the small painted face. "I am so sorry I could not keep you safe." She did not know how long she sat there, holding the portrait against her chest, tears finally falling freely now that there was no one left to see them. She did not hear the footsteps on the stairs above her, did not notice the sound of a key turning in the lock, until the cellar door swung open and lantern light spilled into the darkness around her. She looked up, startled, expecting to see Constance standing there with that same cold satisfaction on her face. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man she had never met, tall and broad-shouldered, his traveling coat still dusted with the marks of a long journey, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief at the sight before him. He held the lantern higher, and his gaze moved from her tear-streaked face to the small portrait clutched tightly in her hands. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, "and why in God's name are you locked in my cellar?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but for a moment no words would come at all. "My lady," the man said again, setting the lantern down on a nearby barrel and crouching to her level, his voice gentler now, though the confusion had not left his face. "I asked you a question. Who are you, and who gave the order to lock you down here?" Margaret's throat felt tight, and it took her a moment to find her voice. "Forgive me, sir. I did not mean to cause trouble. My name is Margaret Ashworth. I was told the master of this house was away, and that his sister, Lady Constance, was to receive me in his place." The man's expression shifted, something hardening behind his eyes. "I am the master of this house," he said, "Alaric Ravensworth, and I have been away exactly as you say, though clearly I did not leave soon enough to prevent whatever has happened here." Margaret felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her, sharper now that she understood who stood before her. She had imagined meeting the Duke under very different circumstances, in a drawing room perhaps, dressed properly, composed and dignified, not huddled on a wooden crate in a damp cellar with tears still drying on her cheeks. "Your Grace," she said, struggling to rise, though her legs were stiff from the cold and the hours of sitting. "I did not intend for you to find me like this." "Sit, please," Alaric said quickly, extending a hand to steady her when she swayed. "There is no need to stand on my account, not after whatever ordeal you have clearly been through." She allowed him to help her back down onto the crate, grateful despite herself for the warmth of his hand, however brief the contact. He remained crouched before her, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel strangely exposed, though not unkindly so. His eyes moved once more to the small portrait still clutched in her hands, and something in his expression softened even further. "May I ask what that is?" he said, "the picture you are holding." Margaret's grip on the portrait tightened instinctively, an old habit born of years spent protecting the one thing she could not bear to lose. But something about the way he asked, without demand, without suspicion, only quiet curiosity, made her hesitate rather than refuse outright. "It is nothing that concerns the missing brooch, if that is what you fear," she said. "I would never take anything that did not belong to me, Your Grace. I know how that must sound, coming from a woman found sitting in your cellar in the middle of the night, but it is the truth. I did not ask because I suspected you of anything, Alaric said. I asked because you are holding it as though your life depended on it, and I would like to understand why. Margaret studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the same cruelty she had encountered in his sister, and found none. There was something steady in his gaze, something that made her think, perhaps foolishly, that he might actually listen if she chose to speak. "It is a picture of my daughter," she said quietly. "She died when she was very young. This is the only image I have of her." Something flickered across Alaric's face, an emotion she could not quite name, though it looked something like sorrow, or perhaps recognition of a grief he understood better than most men his position might be expected to. He did not offer empty words of comfort, did not rush to fill the silence with platitudes the way so many people did when faced with another's loss. Instead, he simply nodded, as though absorbing the weight of what she had told him, giving it the respect it deserved. "I am sorry," he said finally. "That is a burden no one should have to carry alone." "I have carried it long enough to manage," Margaret replied, though her voice wavered slightly on the words. Alaric rose to his feet and extended a hand to help her up. "Whatever happened here tonight, it ends now. You should not be sitting in a cold cellar at this hour, accused of a crime with no evidence against you. Come, let us find you somewhere warm, and then you will tell me exactly what took place while I was away." Margaret hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, more from exhaustion than injury, and he kept a careful hold on her arm as they climbed the narrow stairs out of the cellar and into the brighter light of the hallway above. The house was quiet at this hour, most of the household having retired for the night, though a few candles still burned in the corridor sconces, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Alaric led her to a small sitting room near the kitchens, away from the more formal parts of the house, and called for one of the maids to bring tea and a blanket. It was Elena who answered the call, her eyes widening with relief when she saw Margaret walking beside the Duke, clearly no worse for her ordeal than exhaustion and cold. "Oh, thank goodness," Elena murmured, hurrying to fetch the requested items without further prompting. Once Margaret was settled in a chair near the small fire that had been hastily lit, a warm cup of tea in her hands and a blanket draped over her shoulders, Alaric took the seat across from her, his expression grave. "Now," he said, "tell me everything. From the beginning." Margaret took a steadying breath and began to recount the events of the past 3 days, her arrival, the cold reception from Constance, the accusation regarding the missing brooch, the search of her room that had turned up nothing, and finally the order that had sent her down into the cellar for the night. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with the caution of a woman who had learned not to expect belief or sympathy from those with more power than herself. But Alaric listened without interruption, his jaw tightening more and more with each detail she shared. "And you have no idea what happened to the brooch," he said when she finished. "None, Your Grace, I never even saw it. I have spent most of my time here in my room, avoiding the rest of the household as much as I could manage, given the welcome I received." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though working through something in his mind. "My sister has always had a sharp tongue and a suspicious nature," he said finally, "but this goes beyond her usual unkindness. To lock a guest in the cellar overnight without a shred of proof, that is not simply rudeness, that is cruelty." "I do not wish to cause discord between you and your family," Margaret said quickly. "I only wanted a place to stay while I sorted out my circumstances. I never intended to become a source of conflict." "You did not create this conflict," Alaric said, his voice firm. "My sister did, the moment she chose to treat an innocent woman as a criminal without cause. I will speak with her in the morning, and I will make certain nothing of this sort happens again while you remain under my roof." Margaret looked up at him, searching his face once more, uncertain whether to trust the sincerity she saw there. She had learned, through hard experience, that promises made in the heat of a difficult moment did not always survive the light of day. But there was something in the steadiness of his gaze, something in the quiet anger that still simmered beneath his controlled exterior that made her want to believe him. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly. "You did not have to intervene tonight. Many men in your position would have simply let the matter run its course." "Many men in my position are fools," Alaric replied, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "I have no interest in being counted among them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, the warmth slowly returning to Margaret's cold limbs. She found herself studying him in return, this man who had appeared so suddenly in the darkness of the cellar and turned her entire night upside down with nothing more than a few kind words and a willingness to listen. He was not what she had expected. She had imagined, based on his sister's demeanor and the general reputation of noble families she had encountered before, a man of similar coldness, someone who would view her presence as an inconvenience at best and a burden at worst. Instead, she found a man whose eyes held genuine concern, whose questions came from curiosity rather than suspicion, and whose anger on her behalf seemed entirely sincere. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said after a while. "Of course. Why did you come down to the cellar tonight? Surely you had only just arrived home. You could have waited until morning to hear of any trouble in the house." Alaric considered the question for a moment before answering. One of the stable hands mentioned, in passing, that there had been some commotion earlier in the evening involving a guest and a missing piece of jewelry. He did not know the details, only that voices had been raised and that someone had been taken below stairs. Something about it troubled me enough that I did not want to wait until morning to understand what had happened. I am glad now that I did not. "As am I," Margaret admitted. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the late hour, and Alaric rose from his seat. "You should rest. Whatever conversation needs to happen regarding tonight's events can wait until morning, when tempers have cooled and clearer heads can prevail. I will have a leaner show you back to your room, and I will ensure no one disturbs you further tonight." Margaret rose as well, still holding the blanket around her shoulders, still clutching the small portrait she had never once let go of throughout the entire ordeal. "Thank you," she said again, "for everything." Alaric's gaze dropped briefly to the portrait in her hands, and something gentle passed across his features. "I hope, in time, you will feel comfortable enough in this house to share more about her if you wish to. But there is no obligation. Grief is not owed to anyone as an explanation." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a small measure of relief she had not expected to feel that night, given how it had begun. "Perhaps in time," she said. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Lady Ashworth." As Eleanor led her back through the quiet corridors toward her room, Margaret allowed herself, for the first time since her husband's death, a small flicker of something that felt almost like hope. It was fragile, uncertain, and she did not yet trust it to last. But it was there nonetheless, and for tonight, that was enough. Behind her, in the small sitting room, Alaric remained standing by the dying fire for a long while, his thoughts turning over the events of the evening again and again. There was something about the widow's quiet dignity in the face of such treatment that had struck him deeply. Something about the way she had guarded that small portrait as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had taken everything else from her. He thought of his sister's cold judgment, delivered without evidence, without mercy, and felt his anger stir anew. Tomorrow, he decided, there would be answers. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly what had driven Constance to such cruelty, and he would make certain that whatever happened next, Margaret Ashworth would not suffer for it any further. He had no way of knowing, as he finally made his way toward his own chambers that night, just how much more complicated the truth of the missing brooch would turn out to be, or how deeply his own household secrets would soon draw him into a mystery far larger than a single piece of jewelry. Morning arrived at Blackthorn Hall with a pale gray light that filtered through the tall windows of the breakfast room, and Margaret found herself summoned there before she had even finished dressing. Eleanor delivered the message with a nervous flutter in her voice, explaining that the Duke wished to speak with both his sister and Margaret together, and that he was already waiting. Margaret's stomach twisted with apprehension as she made her way down the main staircase. She had slept little the night before, her mind replaying the events of the cellar over and over, and though Alaric's kindness had offered some comfort, she knew that Constance would not simply accept correction without a fight. Women like Constance did not surrender ground easily, especially not to a woman they viewed as beneath them. When Margaret entered the breakfast room, she found Alaric already seated at the head of the long table, his expression composed but unmistakably firm. Constance sat to his right, her posture rigid, her eyes flashing with barely restrained irritation the moment Margaret crossed the threshold. "Sit, please," Alaric said, gesturing to the chair across from his sister. "We have matters to discuss." Margaret took her seat, keeping her hands folded carefully in her lap, aware of Constance's gaze burning into her from across the table. "I understand," Alaric began, his voice measured but carrying an edge that Margaret had not heard the night before, "that in my absence a guest under this roof was accused of theft without evidence, subjected to a search of her belongings, and then locked in the cellar overnight when that search produced nothing. She is not a guest, Alaric, she is a stranger who arrived with a sad story and an empty purse," Constance said sharply. "And need I remind you that jewelry belonging to our mother is still missing? Someone in this house took it. Forgive me for suspecting the one person none of us actually know." "You had no proof," Alaric said. "None. You searched her room and found nothing, and rather than reconsidering your accusation, you chose instead to punish her for your own failure to find the truth." Constance's jaw tightened. "I did what I believed was necessary to protect this family's property." "You humiliated an innocent woman," Alaric replied. "And in doing so, you have brought shame upon this family far greater than the loss of a single brooch ever could." The room fell into a tense silence. Margaret kept her eyes lowered, uncomfortable being discussed as though she were not present, though she was grateful, deeply so, for Alaric's willingness to defend her. Still, she could feel the weight of Constance's resentment growing heavier by the moment, and she understood with a sinking certainty that this confrontation would not soften her hostess's feelings toward her. If anything, it would only sharpen them. "I will find the brooch," Alaric continued, "and I will find out exactly how it went missing. But until that time, Lady Ashworth is to be treated with the respect owed to any guest in this house. Is that understood?" Constance's eyes flicked toward Margaret with open contempt before returning to her brother. "As you wish," she said stiffly, though her tone made clear the matter was far from settled in her own mind. "But do not say I failed to warn you, brother, when this woman's true nature reveals itself in time." She rose from the table without waiting for a response and swept from the room, her skirts trailing behind her like a storm cloud, retreating only far enough to gather strength for its return. Alaric let out a long breath once she had gone, rubbing a hand across his face. "I apologize for my sister's behavior," he said. "It was inexcusable, and I intend to see the matter properly resolved." "You do not owe me an apology, Your Grace," Margaret said quietly. "You have already done more than I expected." "Perhaps," Alaric said, "but I intend to do more still. I would like to speak with the household staff today, individually if necessary, to understand exactly what happened the day the brooch disappeared. I do not believe in accusations without evidence, Lady Ashworth, and I do not intend to let this matter rest until I understand the truth." Margaret nodded, though a small knot of worry formed in her chest at the thought of further scrutiny, even if it was not directed at her. She had learned, through painful experience, that investigations into household matters rarely remained contained, and she feared what other secrets might surface in the process, secrets that had nothing to do with her but that might still touch her circumstances in ways she could not predict. Over the following days, Alaric began a quiet but thorough inquiry into the disappearance of the emerald brooch. He spoke first with the housekeeper, a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who had served the family for over 20 years and knew every corner of the household better than anyone else alive. She confirmed that the brooch had last been seen on the evening in question, resting in its usual place in Constance's jewelry box, and that no one outside the immediate household staff would have had reason to enter Constance's chambers that day. "Who attended to my sister's rooms that day?" Alaric asked. "Myself and young Grace, who has been assisting with the upper floor cleaning these past few months," Mrs. Whitfield replied. "Though I should say, Your Grace, Grace has been a reliable girl since she arrived. I would be surprised to learn she had any hand in this." Alaric made note of the name and continued his questioning throughout the day, speaking with footmen, gardeners, and kitchen staff, gathering small pieces of information that, taken together, began to paint a picture far more complicated than a simple case of theft. Several servants mentioned that Constance had been unusually agitated in the days leading up to the disappearance, snapping at staff over minor matters and pacing the halls late into the evening. One footman recalled overhearing raised voices coming from Constance's study, though he could not identify who she had been speaking with, only that the conversation had sounded heated. Margaret, for her part, tried to stay out of the investigation as much as possible, spending her days in quiet pursuits, mending, reading from the small selection of books available in the guest wing, and continuing her morning walks around the grounds. But she could not entirely escape the tension that had settled over the household since the confrontation at breakfast. Constance made her displeasure known in small ways: cold glances across the dining table, pointed remarks disguised as polite conversation, and a general chill that followed Margaret wherever she went within Constance's sight. Eleanor, however, had grown noticeably warmer toward Margaret since the night in the cellar, taking every opportunity to offer small kindnesses and quiet conversation whenever their paths crossed. It was during one such conversation, several days into the investigation, that Eleanor shared something that gave Margaret pause. "I probably shouldn't say anything," Eleanor said, glancing around the empty corridor before lowering her voice, "but I heard Grace crying in the linen closet yesterday. When I asked what was wrong, she wouldn't say, only that she was frightened of losing her position here. I don't know what that has to do with anything, my lady, but it seemed strange to me, given everything that's happened." Margaret filed the information away, uncertain what to make of it, though a small suspicion began to form in the back of her mind. She mentioned the conversation to Alaric later that evening, when he sought her out briefly in the small sitting room where they had first spoken after the cellar incident, a room that had, without either of them quite acknowledging it, become something of a regular meeting place between them in the evenings. "Grace, frightened of losing her position," Alaric repeated thoughtfully, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "That is worth investigating further. Fear like that often points to guilt, or to knowledge of someone else's guilt." "I did not want to cause trouble for the girl if it is nothing," Margaret said. "I only thought it worth mentioning." "You were right to mention it," Alaric assured her. "Every piece of information matters in a matter like this. I will speak with her tomorrow, carefully, so as not to frighten her further than she already seems to be." Their evening conversations, Margaret had noticed, had grown longer and more comfortable with each passing day. What had begun as a brief exchange of information regarding the investigation had slowly transformed into something warmer, something that felt, to Margaret's quiet surprise, almost like friendship. Alaric asked about her life before her arrival at Blackthorn Hall, about her marriage to Edmund Ashworth, about the small home they had shared before circumstances took it from her. He listened with genuine interest, never pressing when she grew quiet on more painful subjects, always allowing her the space to share only what she was ready to share. In turn, Margaret learned about Alaric's own history, about the responsibilities that had fallen to him far earlier than expected when their father passed away, about the strain that had existed between himself and Constance for years, long before Margaret's arrival had ever entered the picture. Constance, it seemed, had always resented the weight of expectation placed upon her as a woman in their family, expectations that had hardened over time into a bitterness she directed at anyone she perceived as a threat to her already uncertain position within the household. "She was not always this way," Alaric admitted one evening, staring into the fire with a troubled expression. "When we were children, she was kind, even gentle. But our father was a demanding man, and he made it clear from an early age that Constance's value in this family depended entirely on the marriage she would one day secure. When that marriage fell through, years ago, under circumstances she has never fully explained to me, something in her changed. She grew guarded, suspicious, as though she believed everyone around her was waiting for an opportunity to diminish her further. "That does not excuse her cruelty," Margaret said carefully, "but it does help me understand it a little better." "It does not excuse it," Alaric agreed. "But I hope, in time, it might explain why she reacted to your arrival the way she did. A grieving widow, arriving with nothing, asking for shelter, might have seemed to her like a reminder of exactly the kind of vulnerability she has spent years trying to protect herself against." Margaret considered this for a long moment. There was a strange kind of sympathy stirring in her chest for a woman who had treated her so unkindly, though it did little to soften the sting of the humiliation she had already endured. Still, she found herself grateful for Alaric's honesty, for his willingness to share the more difficult parts of his family's history rather than presenting only a polished, guarded version of himself. The following morning, Alaric spoke privately with Grace, the young maid Mrs. Whitfield had mentioned as having attended to Constance's chambers on the day the brooch disappeared. What he learned from that conversation would set the entire investigation on a very different course, one that would eventually lead him far closer to the truth than he had expected, and far closer to understanding his own sister's role in the matter than he was entirely prepared for. Grace, it turned out, had indeed noticed something unusual that day, though fear of losing her position had kept her from speaking of it sooner. She had seen Constance enter her own chambers late in the afternoon, well after the jewelry box had last been checked, and remained there alone for nearly half an hour before emerging again, her expression tight and unreadable. Grace had thought little of it at the time, assuming her mistress simply wished for privacy. But in the days since, as the household had grown increasingly consumed by the search for the missing brooch, the memory had begun to trouble her more and more. "I did not want to say anything, Your Grace," Grace admitted, her hands twisting nervously in her apron as she spoke. "I feared what might happen if I accused Lady Constance of anything, given her temper. But it did not sit right with me, watching that poor widow blamed for something I could not help but wonder if my lady had a hand in herself." Alaric thanked the girl for her honesty, and assured her that her position within the household was not at risk for having come forward, though privately, his mind was already racing ahead to the implications of what he had just learned. If Constance had entered her own chambers alone, after the brooch had last been confirmed present, and emerged with an unreadable expression shortly before reporting it missing, the timeline raised questions that demanded answers, questions he was no longer certain he wanted to ask his sister directly, not until he had gathered enough evidence to be certain of what he was truly dealing with. He found Margaret later that afternoon, walking her usual path along the eastern edge of the gardens, and shared what he had learned, watching her expression shift from surprise to careful consideration as she absorbed the implications. "You believe your sister may have hidden the brooch herself," Margaret said slowly, "and used its disappearance as a pretense to accuse me." "I do not want to believe it," Alaric admitted, "but I cannot ignore what the evidence suggests. And if that is the truth, I intend to find proof of it, no matter how uncomfortable that proof might prove to be for my own family." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light filter through the branches of the oak trees above them. "Whatever the truth turns out to be," she said finally, "I am grateful that you are willing to seek it, rather than simply accepting the easier explanation." Alaric turned to look at her, something warm and steady in his expression that made Margaret's breath catch slightly in her chest. "I could not accept the easier explanation," he said quietly, "not when it meant allowing an injustice to stand uncorrected. Not when it meant allowing you to continue suffering for a crime I do not believe you committed." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of the unfolding mystery settling between them alongside something else, something neither of them had yet found the words to acknowledge, though it had been growing steadily with each conversation, each shared confidence, each quiet evening spent together by the fire. Margaret found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, looking forward to the days ahead rather than simply enduring them, uncertain what the coming revelations would bring, but no longer entirely alone in facing them. News of Grace's testimony did not stay contained within the walls of Alaric's private study for long. Households like Blackthorn Hall thrived on quiet observation and quieter gossip, and within 2 days, whispers had begun circulating among the staff that Lady Constance herself might be connected to the missing brooch in ways no one had previously considered. Margaret heard the whispers secondhand, through Alina, who reported them with a mixture of nervous excitement and genuine concern for how the household might weather such a scandal. "I do not think it wise for people to be speculating so openly," Margaret said one afternoon, as Alina helped her mend a small tear in the sleeve of her dress. "If Lady Constance hears such talk, it will only make matters worse for everyone involved, myself included." "I know, my lady," Alina admitted, "but it is difficult to keep such things quiet in a house this size. People notice when the Duke spends an hour questioning the staff, and they draw their own conclusions." Margaret could not fault the logic, though she worried nonetheless about the growing tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the household now. Constance had grown noticeably colder in the days since her brother's questioning began, retreating more and more into her own chambers, emerging only for meals, during which she said very little and regarded everyone at the table with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. It was during one such tense evening meal that Constance finally broke her silence, setting down her fork with enough force to draw the attention of everyone seated at the table. "I understand," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "that my own household staff are being questioned as though I were some common criminal in my own home. I would like to know, brother, exactly what it is you believe I have done." Alaric met her gaze steadily. "I am simply trying to understand what happened to the brooch, Constance. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear from my questions." "How dare you," Constance said, her voice rising. "I raised the alarm about that brooch. I am the one who noticed it missing. And now you treat me as though I am the thief, simply because a maid claims to have seen me in my own chambers. Doing what, exactly? Existing in a room that belongs to me." "Grace mentioned that you emerged from your chambers looking distressed, shortly before you reported the brooch missing," Alaric said calmly. "I am not accusing you of anything, Constance. I am gathering information, as I would for any matter of importance within this household." Constance's eyes flicked briefly toward Margaret, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, and the fury in her expression sharpened further. "This is her doing," she said. "Ever since this woman arrived, this family has been turned upside down. First you defend her against a reasonable suspicion, and now you turn your suspicion on your own sister, based on nothing more than the whispers of a servant girl." "I have made no accusations against you," Alaric repeated, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. "I am simply seeking the truth. If that troubles you, perhaps you should consider why." Constance rose from the table so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing startled glances from the rest of the household present. "I will not sit here and be interrogated in my own home," she said, and swept from the dining room without another word, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Margaret exchanged a glance with Alaric across the table, uncertain what to say in the aftermath of such an outburst. The rest of the meal continued in subdued quiet, conversation limited to polite, careful topics that avoided the elephant that had so recently occupied the room. Later that evening, in their now familiar meeting place by the fire, Alaric expressed his growing frustration with the situation. "I do not wish to believe my own sister capable of such deception," he admitted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of weariness Margaret had not seen from him before. "But her reaction tonight troubles me more than I care to admit. An innocent woman, wrongly accused, would not react with such fury to simple questions. Grief and fear can make people behave in ways that do not reflect their true character," Margaret offered gently, though she privately harbored her own doubts about Constance's innocence. "Perhaps she feels cornered, regardless of her guilt or lack thereof. Perhaps, Alaric said, though he did not sound entirely convinced. He was quiet for a moment before changing the subject, his expression softening as he studied her across the small space between their chairs. "You have not spoken much of your husband since your arrival," he said. "I do not wish to pry, but I find myself curious about the man who was fortunate enough to share his life with you." Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering how much of her past she wished to share. She had grown more comfortable with Alaric over the past days than she had expected to feel with anyone so soon after her losses, but old habits of guarding her grief closely still lingered. "Edmund was a good man," she said finally. "Kind, though quiet. We were not wealthy, not by the standards of families such as yours, but we were content. He worked as a solicitor in a small town some distance from here, and I managed our home. It was a simple life, but it was a happy one for a time." "What happened?" Alaric asked gently. "Illness took him, quite suddenly, a little over 6 months ago," Margaret said. "A fever that no physician could explain or cure. One week he was well, and the next he was gone. I had barely finished grieving him when I learned that a cousin of his, one I had never even met, held a legal claim to what little property we had, a claim rooted in an old family arrangement Edmund had never thought to mention to me. Within a month of his death, I had lost my husband and my home in the same breath." "I am sorry," Alaric said quietly, and Margaret could hear the sincerity in his voice, the same quiet steadiness she had come to recognize in him over their weeks of acquaintance. "It was not the first loss I have endured," Margaret continued, surprising herself with how easily the words came now, after so many months of silence. "Before Edmund died, we lost our daughter. She was only 14 months old. A sudden illness, much like the one that would later take her father, though the physicians could never say whether the two were connected in any way beyond cruel coincidence." Alaric's expression grew somber, and he leaned forward slightly in his chair, his attention fully fixed on her. "The portrait," he said softly, "the one you were holding in the cellar." "Yes," Margaret said, her voice thickening slightly with emotion she had not entirely mastered even after all this time. "It is the only image I have of her. A traveling artist painted it when she was only a few months old, before we knew how little time we would have with her. I have carried it with me ever since, through everything that has happened since her death and since Edmund's." "What was her name?" Alaric asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he understood instinctively the weight such a question carried. Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes, though for once they did not feel entirely like grief. There was something in the simple act of being asked, of being given space to speak her daughter's name aloud after months of carrying it silently, that felt almost like relief. "Her name was Sophia," she said. "She had her father's eyes and my mother's laugh, or so Edmund always claimed. I do not remember my mother well enough to know if that was true, but I like to believe it." "Sophia," Alaric repeated softly, as though testing the weight of the name, honoring it. "That is a beautiful name." "Thank you," Margaret whispered. They sat together in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly, the weight of shared grief settling comfortably between them rather than driving them apart. Margaret found herself studying Alaric's face in the firelight, noting the quiet compassion in his expression, the absence of the pity she had grown so weary of encountering from others when the subject of her losses arose. He did not look at her as though she were broken, or as though her grief made her somehow less capable or less worthy of respect. He simply listened, and in doing so, offered her something she had not realized she still needed so badly, the simple comfort of being heard. "May I ask you something in return?" Margaret said after a while, curiosity finally overcoming her natural reticence. "Why have you never married, Your Grace? Surely a man in your position has faced no shortage of expectation on that front." Alaric let out a soft, humorless laugh. "No shortage indeed," he said. "My father spent the last years of his life attempting to arrange a suitable match for me, convinced that securing an advantageous marriage was the final duty required of a duke's heir. I resisted, partly out of stubbornness, and partly because I never found myself drawn to any of the women paraded before me for that particular purpose." They were pleasant enough, accomplished, well suited to the role expected of a duchess in every practical sense, but I found no genuine connection with any of them, nothing beyond polite conversation and mutual obligation. And you were content to remain unmarried, rather than settle for such an arrangement? Margaret asked. I suppose I was, Alaric said, though my sister would likely tell you it was simply stubbornness on my part, a refusal to accept my responsibilities as seriously as she has always felt obligated to accept her own. Perhaps there is some truth in that. But I never saw the purpose in binding myself to someone for the sake of practicality alone, when so much of life's meaning seems to come from genuine connection instead. Margaret felt something warm stir in her chest at his words, though she quickly reminded herself of the vast difference in their circumstances. A duke and a penniless widow with nothing left to offer beyond her company and her gratitude for his kindness. It would be foolish, she told herself, to read too much into a simple, honest conversation shared between two people who had both endured their own forms of loss. And yet, as the evening wore on and their conversation continued to flow easily between lighter subjects and deeper reflections, Margaret could not entirely quiet the small, hopeful voice that had begun to whisper within her, suggesting that perhaps this connection, however unlikely, however complicated by circumstance and station, might grow into something neither of them had expected to find. Their conversation was interrupted, eventually, by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor outside, followed by a soft knock at the door. Elena appeared, her expression troubled, informing Alaric that Mrs. Whitfield had requested his presence immediately regarding a matter she described only as urgent. Alaric rose at once, offering Margaret a brief, apologetic look before following Elena from the room. Margaret remained by the fire a while longer, her thoughts still lingering on their conversation, unaware that the urgent matter awaiting Alaric downstairs would soon bring the investigation into the missing brooch to a dramatic and unexpected turning point, one that would test not only the truth of Constance's involvement, but the strength of the fragile trust that had begun to grow between herself and the Duke. Mrs. Whitfield was waiting in the small study near the entrance hall when Alaric arrived, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her usually composed expression tight with worry. Beside her stood Grace, the young maid who had first come forward with information about Constance's behavior on the day the brooch disappeared, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling visibly. "Forgive the late hour, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, "but I felt this could not wait until morning. Grace has something further she wishes to tell you, though I fear it took considerable courage for her to come forward a second time." Alaric turned his attention to Grace, softening his expression in an attempt to put the frightened girl at ease. "Whatever you have to say, Grace, you may speak freely. No harm will come to you for telling the truth in this house, not while I have any say in the matter." Grace took a shaking breath before beginning. "Your Grace, after I spoke with you before about seeing Lady Constance leave her chambers looking distressed, I was approached the following day by Lady Constance herself." Alaric's expression sharpened. "Go on." "She found me in the linen closet, Your Grace, and she made it very clear that she knew I had spoken with you. She did not shout or threaten me outright, but she made it plain that my position here, and my family's welfare beyond these walls, depended on my willingness to reconsider what I had told you. She suggested, quite firmly, that perhaps I had been mistaken about the timing of what I saw, and that it would be in my best interest to correct my earlier statement." "She threatened you," Alaric said, his voice low and controlled, though Margaret, had she been present, would have recognized the same simmering anger she had witnessed the night he found her in the cellar. "She did not use those words exactly, Your Grace, but I understood her meaning clearly enough. I have a younger brother who works in the stables here, and Lady Constance made certain I understood that his position, along with my own, could be reconsidered should I continue to, as she put it, spread unfounded gossip about matters that did not concern me." Alaric closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of what he was hearing. His own sister, using her position within the household to intimidate a young servant into silence, all to protect herself from questions regarding a piece of jewelry she claimed had been stolen from her. The picture forming in his mind grew darker with each new detail, and he found himself struggling to reconcile this version of Constance with the sister he had grown up alongside, however strained their relationship had become over the years. "You did the right thing coming to me with this, Grace," Alaric said finally. "I promise you, neither your position nor your brother's will be affected by anything you have shared, now or previously. You have my word." Grace nodded, though her relief was tempered by clear exhaustion, the strain of carrying such a secret evidently having taken its toll on the young woman over the preceding days. Mrs. Whitfield placed a comforting hand on her shoulder before addressing Alaric directly. "There is one more matter, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said. "Grace mentioned something else to me earlier this evening, something she had not thought significant until she heard the other staff discussing the ongoing investigation. It concerns a locked drawer in Lady Constance's writing desk, one that Grace has never had cause or permission to open, but which she recalls Lady Constance visiting with unusual frequency in the days following the brooch's disappearance." Alaric considered this information carefully. A locked drawer, visited with unusual frequency, in the same chambers from which the brooch had vanished. It was not proof of anything definitive, not on its own, but combined with everything else he had learned over the preceding days, it painted an increasingly troubling picture of his sister's possible involvement in a deception that had already caused significant harm to an innocent woman under his protection. "Thank you both for coming to me with this," Alaric said. "I will handle the matter from here. Grace, please try to rest. You have nothing further to worry about." After Mrs. Whitfield and Grace had departed, Alaric remained alone in the study for a long while, weighing his options carefully. He could confront Constance directly, demanding access to the locked drawer, but such a confrontation, without concrete proof of what it might contain, risked only deepening the rift already forming between them, and might give Constance ample opportunity to dispose of any evidence before he could examine it properly. He needed a different approach, one that would allow him to uncover the truth without alerting his sister to the fact that her secret, whatever it was, had already begun to unravel. He decided, after much consideration, to wait until the following day, when Constance would be occupied with her usual morning correspondence in the drawing room, well away from her private chambers. It was not an approach he felt entirely comfortable with, searching his own sister's belongings without her knowledge, but the stakes, both for Margaret's reputation and for the truth itself, felt too significant to ignore. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog settled over the grounds of Blackthorn Hall, lending the entire estate an eerie, muted quality that seemed to mirror the tension building within its walls. Alaric waited until he had confirmed Constance's presence in the drawing room, her attention fully absorbed in a stack of letters that had arrived with the morning post, before making his way quietly to her private chambers. Mrs. Whitfield accompanied him, carrying a small ring of keys that included, among the many others required for the household's daily operations, one that fit the lock of Constance's writing desk, a key that had been used sparingly over the years, primarily for occasions when Constance herself had misplaced her own copy. The desk drawer opened with a soft click, and Alaric found himself staring down at its contents with a growing sense of unease. There, nestled among a small collection of letters and personal papers, sat the missing emerald brooch, exactly as Constance had described it in her initial report, its green stones catching the pale morning light filtering through the chamber's tall windows. But it was not the brooch alone that caught Alaric's attention. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon, correspondence that appeared, from the dates visible on the topmost pages, to span several years. Alaric hesitated only briefly before untying the ribbon and beginning to read, aware that he was crossing a line of privacy he would not have crossed under ordinary circumstances, but driven by a growing certainty that the truth of this entire situation extended far beyond a simple act of jealousy or spite directed at Margaret. The letters, it turned out, were from a man named Nathaniel Everleigh, A gentleman Constance had been secretly engaged to nearly 8 years earlier. Before the arrangement had fallen apart under circumstances Alaric had never fully understood. The letters painted a picture of a passionate, hopeful young woman, so different from the guarded, brittle sister he knew now. A woman who had once believed wholeheartedly in the promise of a future built on genuine affection rather than practical obligation. The final letter in the bundle, dated some months after the engagement's dissolution, revealed the painful truth Constance had carried silently for years. Nathaniel had broken their engagement not out of any failing on Constance's part, but because his own family had discovered a more advantageous match for him, one that better served their financial interests. He had written to Constance with cold, practical justification, expressing regret for the pain his decision might cause, while making clear that sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with duty and family obligation. Alaric sat back, the weight of this discovery settling heavily upon him. He understood now with painful clarity why the arrival of a widow like Margaret, a woman who had lost everything, and yet still carried herself with quiet dignity and depth of feeling, might have struck some raw, unhealed wound within his sister. Constance had spent years building walls around herself, convincing herself that sentiment and vulnerability led only to pain and humiliation, and Margaret's presence, however unintentional, had threatened to expose the fragility of those walls. But understanding the source of his sister's bitterness did not excuse the cruelty of her actions. Whatever pain Constance carried from her own past, it did not justify the deliberate harm she had inflicted upon an innocent woman, nor the intimidation she had used against a vulnerable young servant to protect her own secret. Alaric carefully retied the bundle of letters and placed them back in the drawer exactly as he had found them, taking only the brooch with him as he closed and relocked the desk. He would need to confront Constance with what he had learned, but he found himself uncertain how best to approach a conversation that promised to be among the most difficult of his life, one that would require him to balance his anger at her treatment of Margaret against a newfound, complicated compassion for the wounds that had driven her to such behavior in the first place. He found Margaret later that morning in the small library adjoining the drawing room, seated near the window with a book open in her lap, though her attention seemed to be drifting toward the misty grounds outside rather than the pages before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression brightening slightly at the sight of him, though it quickly shifted to concern when she registered the troubled look on his face. "You found something," she said, setting the book aside. "I found the brooch," Alaric confirmed, drawing the piece of jewelry from his pocket and holding it up for her to see. "Exactly where I feared it might be." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "It was in my sister's own writing desk," Alaric said, sitting down heavily in the chair across from her, "along with a bundle of old letters that explained, I think, far more about her behavior than I ever wanted to understand." He shared with Margaret the substance of what he had discovered, the broken engagement, the painful correspondence, the wound that Constance had carried silently for nearly a decade, allowing it to fester into the bitterness and suspicion that now governed so much of her behavior toward the world around her. Margaret listened quietly, her expression softening with a compassion that surprised even herself, given everything Constance had put her through since her arrival. "I do not excuse what she did to you," Alaric said, "but I find myself understanding it a little better now, even if that understanding does not make it acceptable. Grief and rejection can twist a person in ways they never intended," Margaret said quietly. "I know something of that myself, though I hope I have never allowed my own pain to cause harm to someone else the way your sister's clearly has." "You have not," Alaric said firmly. "Whatever burdens you carry, you have never once used them as an excuse to inflict cruelty on those around you. That distinction matters a great deal." Margaret considered this for a moment before speaking again. "What will you do now?" "I must confront her," Alaric said. "There is no way around that conversation, however difficult it promises to be." She threatened a young servant girl to protect her secret, and she allowed an innocent woman to suffer public humiliation and imprisonment in our own cellar rather than admit to her own actions. That cannot go unanswered, regardless of the pain that may have driven her to it. Margaret reached out, an instinctive gesture of comfort, and placed her hand gently over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. "Whatever happens in that conversation," she said, "know that I do not hold you responsible for your sister's choices. You have done everything within your power to seek the truth and to protect me from further harm. That is more than I ever expected from anyone in this house." Alaric turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining briefly in a gesture that carried far more weight than either of them had quite intended. A small, quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown steadily between them over the preceding days. Neither of them spoke of it directly, not yet, but the warmth of the moment lingered between them long after their hands eventually parted, a silent promise of something neither was yet ready to name, but which both had begun, in their own quiet ways, to hope for. That afternoon, Alaric summoned Constance to his study, the recovered brooch resting on the desk between them, a silent testament to the truth he could no longer allow her to deny. Constance entered the study with her usual composed bearing, though the sight of the brooch resting on her brother's desk caused a visible flicker of alarm to cross her features before she managed to smooth her expression back into something more guarded. "You wish to see me," she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate calm. "Sit down, Constance," Alaric said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. She lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, her eyes fixed on the brooch, though she said nothing further, waiting for him to speak first. "I found this in your writing desk," Alaric said, "along with a bundle of letters I imagine you would rather I had never seen." Constance's composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes that betrayed the depth of emotion she was working to suppress. "You went through my belongings," she said, her voice tight. "How dare you invade my privacy in such a manner?" "How dare I?" Alaric repeated, his own anger finally breaking through the careful restraint he had maintained throughout the preceding days. "You accused an innocent woman of theft, subjected her to a search of her belongings, and then had her locked in our cellar overnight, all to protect a lie you constructed yourself. And you have the audacity to speak to me of invaded privacy." Constance flinched at the sharpness of his tone, her gaze dropping briefly to her hands folded in her lap before she found the strength to look back up at him. "You do not understand," she said, her voice quieter now, some of the fight draining out of her. "Then explain it to me," Alaric said. "Explain why you hid your own brooch and allowed everyone in this household to believe it had been stolen. Explain why you threatened Grace into silence when she saw something that threatened to expose your deception. Explain why you were willing to see an innocent woman suffer, simply to protect whatever secret you believed that brooch's disappearance would help you keep." Constance was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting together in her lap, before she finally began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not plan any of it, not truly," she said. "I removed the brooch from my jewelry box the night before it went missing, intending only to have the clasp repaired, as it had grown loose in recent weeks. I placed it in my desk drawer for safekeeping, meaning to send it to the jeweler the following morning, and then simply forgot about it entirely amid the arrival of our unexpected guest." "And when you noticed it missing," Alaric prompted. "I panicked," Constance admitted. "I could not remember, in that first moment of alarm, where I had placed it. And when I searched my chambers and could not find it immediately, my first thought went to the widow who had arrived just days before, a stranger in our home with every reason, as far as I was concerned, to seek some advantage from her presence here." "So you accused her before you had even confirmed the brooch was truly missing," Alaric said, his disbelief evident. "By the time I remembered where I had placed it, the accusation had already spread through the household," Constance said, her voice growing strained. "Servants were searching her room. Everyone had already begun to believe her guilty. I told myself, in that moment, that correcting the mistake would only humiliate me further. that it would be simpler to let the matter resolve itself quietly rather than admit that I had wrongly accused an innocent woman based on nothing more than my own carelessness and suspicion. Simpler for you, Alaric said. Not for her. She spent a night locked in our cellar because you could not bring yourself to admit a simple mistake. Constance's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to allow herself the vulnerability of weeping in front of her brother. I know it was wrong, she said. I have known it was wrong since the moment I remembered where the brooch truly was. But every day that passed made it harder to admit the truth, until I convinced myself that continuing the deception was the only path left available to me. And Grace, Alaric pressed. You threatened a young servant girl and her family's livelihood simply to protect yourself from the consequences of your own mistake. I was frightened, Constance said, her voice cracking now. Frightened of what would happen if the truth came out. Frightened of how you would look at me if you knew what I had done. Frightened of becoming, in your eyes and in the eyes of everyone in this household, exactly the kind of cruel, small-minded woman our father always feared I would become if I did not secure a proper marriage to define my worth. The mention of their father and of the old wound Alaric now understood far better than he had before this conversation began, softened something in his expression, though his anger had not entirely dissipated. Nathaniel ever lie, he said quietly. Constance's face paled at the mention of the name. You read the letters. I did, Alaric admitted. I am sorry for the pain those letters clearly represent, Constance. I did not know the full truth of what happened between you all those years ago. I am sorry no one in this family ever thought to ask, or to offer you the comfort you deserved after such a betrayal. Constance's tears finally broke free, though she made no move to wipe them away, seeming almost too exhausted to maintain her usual composed facade any longer. He chose duty over affection, she said quietly. Chose his family's financial interests over whatever feelings he claimed to hold for me. And our father, rather than comforting me, told me simply that I should have expected as much. That sentiment was a luxury women of our station could not afford to indulge, that my failure to secure the match reflected poorly on my own worth rather than on Nathaniel's character. That was cruel of him to say, Alaric said softly. You did not deserve such treatment, not from Nathaniel and not from our father. Perhaps not, Constance said, but it shaped me nonetheless. I learned from that experience that vulnerability leads only to pain, that trusting others with one's heart leaves one exposed to exactly the kind of humiliation and disappointment I endured. When the widow arrived, carrying her grief so openly, so willing to trust in the kindness of strangers despite everything she had lost, something in me resented her for it. Resented the ease with which she seemed to invite your sympathy, your protection, things I have spent years convincing myself I did not need from anyone. Alaric absorbed this confession slowly, understanding now the full, tangled roots of his sister's cruelty, roots that stretched back far further than Margaret's arrival, into years of unaddressed pain, and a father's cold, dismissive parenting that had taught Constance to armor herself against a world she had come to view as fundamentally unkind. None of that excuses what you did, Alaric said finally, though his voice had softened considerably from its earlier sharpness. Margaret suffered because of choices you made, choices you continued to make even after you knew the truth. That requires accountability, Constance, regardless of the pain that led you to those choices. I know, Constance said quietly. What would you have me do? Alaric considered the question carefully before answering. You will apologize to her, he said. Directly and sincerely, not as a formality but as a genuine acknowledgement of the harm you caused. And you will apologize to Grace as well, for the fear you caused her and the threats you made against her family's security. Beyond that, I think it would benefit you to consider seeking support beyond the walls of this house, someone who might help you address the wounds you have carried alone for so many years. You cannot continue living behind walls built from old pain, Constance. It is destroying whatever happiness you might otherwise find. Constance nodded slowly, wiping at her tears now with the back of her hand, some of the old rigidity returning to her posture, though it seemed, to Alaric's careful observation, a steadier, more genuine composure than the brittle defensiveness she had maintained throughout their earlier conversation. "I will speak with her," she said, "and with grace. I owe them both far more than a simple apology, but I will begin there." "Thank you," Alaric said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt a genuine flicker of hope that some measure of healing might yet be possible between himself and his sister, that the walls she had built around herself might, with time and patience, begin to soften into something more open, more capable of genuine connection with those around her. Constance rose from her chair, pausing at the door before she left the study. "The widow," she said, using the term with less contempt than she had carried in previous weeks, "she has changed something in you, Alaric. I have not seen you speak with such conviction, such passion about anything in a very long time. Perhaps longer than I care to admit." Alaric said nothing in response, though the warmth that rose in his chest at his sister's observation told him everything he needed to know about the truth of her words. Constance offered a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression of warmth he had seen from her in longer than he could remember, before slipping quietly from the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the recovered brooch still resting on the desk before him. Later that evening, true to her word, Constance sought out Margaret in the small library where she often spent her quiet hours, finding her seated near the window as the last light of day faded into dusk beyond the misty grounds. Margaret looked up, surprised, as Constance entered, her posture noticeably different from the cold, imperious bearing she had carried throughout the preceding weeks. "Lady Ashworth," Constance said, her voice carrying none of its former sharpness, "I have come to apologize, and I hope you will allow me the opportunity to do so properly, however inadequate my words may feel against the harm I have caused you." Margaret set aside the book she had been reading, studying Constance's face carefully, searching for any trace of the manipulation she had grown accustomed to encountering from this woman, and finding instead something that looked, remarkably, like genuine humility. "I am listening," Margaret said quietly. Constance drew a steadying breath before continuing. "I accused you of a crime you did not commit, based on nothing more than my own carelessness and suspicion. When I realized my error, I allowed my pride and my fear of humiliation to prevent me from correcting the injustice sooner. You spent a night locked away, frightened and alone, because I could not bring myself to admit a simple mistake. There is no excuse adequate to explain such cruelty, and I do not offer one. I offer only my sincere regret, and my hope that, in time, you might find it within yourself to forgive me, though I understand if such forgiveness does not come easily, or at all." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of the words against the pain she had endured since her arrival at Blackthorn Hall. She thought of the cellar's cold darkness, of the humiliation of being searched and accused without evidence, of the weeks of cold treatment and pointed cruelty she had endured at this woman's hands. And yet, she thought too of Alaric's explanation regarding the wounds that had shaped his sister's behavior, of the old pain that had calcified into bitterness over years of unaddressed grief. "I appreciate your honesty," Margaret said finally, "and I can see that this apology costs you something significant to offer. I will not pretend the harm you caused did not hurt deeply, because it did. But I understand, better than most, how grief and loss can shape a person in ways they never intended, how pain left unaddressed can harden into something that causes further harm to those around us. I am willing to move forward, Lady Constance, if you are willing to treat me, and everyone else in this household, with the respect and honesty you have shown me tonight." Constance's eyes glistened with fresh tears, though these seemed born of relief rather than the earlier anguish of her confession to Alaric. "Thank you," she said softly. "That is more grace than I deserve, but I am grateful for it nonetheless." As Constance turned to leave, she paused once more at the door, glancing back at Margaret with an expression that carried something almost like warmth. "For whatever it is worth," she said, "I have never seen my brother speak of anyone the way he speaks of you. Whatever happens between the two of you, I hope you know that his regard for you is genuine and rare and worth treasuring. Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the observation, though she said nothing in response beyond a soft, grateful smile. Long after Constance had departed, Margaret remained by the window, watching the last light fade from the misty grounds outside, her thoughts lingering on Alaric's steady kindness, on the fragile hope that had begun to bloom within her despite every reason she had to guard her heart against further loss. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, she allowed herself to wonder, quietly and carefully, what a future within these walls, and within the warmth of Alaric's regard, might truly hold for her. In the days that followed, a noticeable shift settled over Blackthorn Hall, as though the entire household had exhaled a breath it had been holding since Margaret's arrival. Constance sought out Grace the following morning, offering a sincere apology for the fear she had caused and assuring the young maid, along with her brother in the stables, that their positions within the household remained entirely secure. Grace accepted the apology with visible relief, and though a certain wariness remained between them for some time afterward, the tension that had gripped the household began, slowly, to ease. Margaret found herself settling into a rhythm at Blackthorn Hall that she had not expected to find, one built on genuine warmth rather than mere tolerance. Constance, though still reserved by nature, made visible efforts to include Margaret in the daily life of the household, inviting her to join afternoon tea in the drawing room, asking after her well-being with what appeared to be sincere interest, and gradually revealing glimpses of the gentler woman Alaric had once known before years of disappointment had hardened her. It was during one such afternoon tea, several weeks after the resolution of the brooch incident, that Constance broached a subject Margaret had not expected her to raise. "You know," Constance said, setting down her teacup with careful precision, "my brother has never once brought a woman to this house whom he actually wished to spend time with. In all my years watching him navigate the expectations placed upon him, I have never seen him seek out anyone's company the way he seeks out yours." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such a direct observation. "We have simply become friends," she said carefully, "given the circumstances of my arrival." "Friends," Constance repeated, a knowing smile touching her lips, softer now than the cold smiles Margaret remembered from her first days in the house. "Perhaps that is where such things begin, Lady Ashworth, but I do not believe that is where they remain, not judging by the way he looks at you when he believes no one else is watching." Margaret said nothing further, though the observation lingered in her thoughts long after their conversation had moved on to other subjects. She had noticed, of course, the growing warmth in Alaric's regard for her, had felt her own heart responding in kind with a tenderness she had not expected to feel again after Edmund's death. But she had been careful, throughout the preceding weeks, to guard against reading too much into their friendship, mindful of the vast difference in their circumstances, and unwilling to allow herself the vulnerability of hope only to have it crushed by the harsh realities of station and expectation. Yet as the weeks continued to pass, that hope proved increasingly difficult to suppress. Alaric's attentions toward her grew steadily more evident, small gestures that spoke louder than words ever could, ensuring her comfort at every turn, seeking her opinion on household matters with a seriousness that suggested genuine respect for her judgment, and finding reasons, again and again, to extend their evening conversations by the fire long after the rest of the household had retired for the night. One evening, as autumn began to settle more firmly over the grounds of Blackthorn Hall, painting the oak trees in brilliant shades of gold and amber, Alaric invited Margaret to join him for a walk through the gardens before the daylight faded entirely. "There is something I wish to discuss with you," he said as they walked, his hands clasped behind his back in a manner that suggested a certain nervous formality unusual for him. Margaret glanced up at him, curiosity mingling with a flutter of anticipation she could not quite suppress. "You may speak freely," she said. "You know that by now, surely." Alaric smiled, though the expression carried a weight of seriousness beneath it. "I have received word," he said, "from a solicitor in the town where you once resided with your late husband, It seems the legal claim against your former property was not as ironclad as your husband's cousin led you to believe. Margaret stopped walking entirely, turning to face him with wide, startled eyes. What do you mean? I took the liberty, some weeks ago, of engaging a solicitor to review the circumstances of your husband's estate, Alaric explained. I hope you will forgive the interference, but I could not stand by, knowing you had been so thoroughly deceived regarding your rights to what should rightfully have been yours. The solicitor has found significant irregularities in the claim your husband's cousin pursued, irregularities that suggest the entire matter may have been built on fraudulent grounds rather than legitimate legal precedent. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the sudden, unexpected turn of conversation. You did this for me. I could not simply watch you lose everything to a man's dishonest scheming without at least attempting to see justice done, Alaric said. The solicitor believes, with proper legal action, you stand a strong chance of reclaiming what was wrongfully taken from you, or at the very least, securing fair compensation for the loss you have suffered. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, though these carried none of the sorrow that had so often accompanied her tears in recent months. I do not know how to thank you for such a gift, she said. You have already given me shelter and friendship, and now this. I fear I shall never find adequate words to express my gratitude. Alaric stepped closer, reaching out to gently brush away a tear that had escaped down her cheek, his touch tender and careful. You need not thank me, he said softly. I did not do this out of obligation, Margaret. I did it because your well-being has come to matter to me more than I ever expected it might, more than I know quite how to express adequately. Margaret's breath caught at the tenderness in his voice, at the use of her given name rather than the formal address he had maintained throughout most of their acquaintance. Alaric, she said softly, testing the intimacy of his own name on her lips for the first time. I have tried, these past weeks, to convince myself that what I feel for you is simply friendship, simply the natural warmth that develops between two people who have weathered a difficult situation together, Alaric continued, his voice growing steadily more earnest. But I can no longer pretend that is the whole truth of it. You have become, in the short time since your arrival, someone whose presence I find myself seeking at every opportunity, whose well-being matters to me more deeply than I know how to properly articulate, whose grief and strength and quiet dignity have moved me in ways I did not expect any woman to move me again. Margaret's heart pounded within her chest, hope and fear tangling together in equal measure. I feel the same, she admitted softly. Though I have been afraid to allow myself such feelings, given everything I have already lost, I did not think myself capable of such tenderness again, not after Edmund, not after Sophia. And yet, here I am, unable to deny what has grown within me these past weeks. I do not wish to rush you, Alaric said carefully. I understand the depth of the grief you carry, and I would never wish to pressure you into feelings you are not ready to embrace. But I wanted you to know the truth of my own heart, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge. Margaret reached up, placing her hand gently against his cheek, a gesture of tenderness she had not offered anyone since her husband's death. You have given me more in these past weeks than I ever expected to receive again from this world, she said softly. Kindness when I expected cruelty, justice when I expected further loss, and now, it seems, affection I did not believe myself capable of accepting again. I am not afraid of what I feel for you, Alaric. I am only afraid of how quickly it has grown, given how briefly we have known one another. Time need not dictate the depth of genuine feeling, Alaric said softly, covering her hand with his own where it rested against his cheek. I have known men who courted for years and never found the connection we have discovered in mere weeks. I do not wish to hurry you toward any decision you are not ready to make, but I wanted you to know that my regard for you is not fleeting, nor built on pity for your circumstances. It is built on genuine admiration for the woman you are, grief and strength and all. They stood together in the fading autumn light, the golden leaves drifting softly around them, neither quite ready to close the distance between them entirely, but both aware that something significant had shifted between them in that quiet garden conversation, a threshold crossed that neither would be able to fully retreat from, even if they wished to. In the days that followed, their courtship, for that was truly what it had become, proceeded with a gentle, careful tenderness that honored the weight of Margaret's past losses while allowing space for new hope to take root. Alaric continued his efforts to secure justice regarding her late husband's estate, engaging additional legal counsel to strengthen the case against the cousin who had so callously deceived her. Constance, true to her word, continued to soften in her treatment of Margaret, eventually becoming something approaching a genuine friend, the two women finding common ground in shared conversations about loss and resilience that neither had expected to discover with the other. Word of the growing attachment between the Duke and the widow eventually spread beyond the walls of Blackthorn Hall, as such things inevitably do within the close, gossiping circles of the surrounding countryside. Not everyone received the news warmly. Several of the more prominent families in the region, who had long harbored hopes of securing the Duke's hand for their own daughters, made their disapproval known through pointed remarks and cold receptions. Whenever Margaret found herself in their company at the occasional social gathering, Alaric insisted she attend by his side. One such gathering, a dinner hosted by a neighboring family of considerable standing, proved particularly trying for Margaret's composure. A woman named Charlotte Pemberton, whose family had long assumed a match between their eldest daughter and the Duke was all but inevitable, made no effort to disguise her disdain for Margaret's presence at the table. "How fortunate for you," Charlotte remarked during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding guests could hear, "that a woman with no fortune and no family connections should find herself so warmly received by a duke. One wonders what circumstances might explain such unusual favor." The insinuation hung heavy in the air, and Margaret felt her cheeks flush with humiliation, old insecurities she had thought largely healed rising once more to the surface. But before she could formulate a response, Alaric's hand found hers beneath the table, steady and reassuring, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a calm authority that silenced the table entirely. "The circumstances, Miss Pemberton, are quite simple," Alaric said. "I hold Lady Ashworth in the highest regard, both for her character and for the strength she has shown in the face of considerable hardship. I would think a woman of your own upbringing might understand the value of genuine character over mere fortune or family connection, but perhaps I credit your understanding too generously." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the assembled guests at the sharpness of his rebuke, and Charlotte's face colored deeply, though she said nothing further on the matter for the remainder of the evening. Margaret squeezed Alaric's hand gratefully beneath the table, moved by his willingness to defend her so publicly, so unequivocally, against the very kind of society judgment she had feared most since her circumstances had changed so drastically. Later that evening, as their carriage made its way back toward Blackthorn Hall through the cool autumn darkness, Margaret turned to Alaric with quiet gratitude evident in her expression. "You did not need to defend me so publicly," she said. "I have grown accustomed to such remarks since my circumstances changed." "You should never have to grow accustomed to cruelty, Margaret," Alaric said firmly, his hand finding hers once more in the dim carriage light. "Not from society, and not from anyone whose opinion matters less to me than your own happiness and well-being. I meant every word I said tonight, and I will continue to say it, as often and as publicly as necessary, until the world understands that my regard for you is not a matter open to debate or diminishment." Margaret leaned her head gently against his shoulder as the carriage continued its journey homeward, the warmth of his presence beside her offering a comfort she had not believed herself capable of finding again after everything she had lost. Whatever challenges society might continue to present, whatever doubts and cruelties might yet arise from those unwilling to accept the growing bond between a duke and a penniless widow, Margaret found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely unafraid of the future that lay ahead. Winter arrived at Blackthorn Hall with its usual quiet grace, blanketing the grounds in a soft layer of frost each morning, though the chill outside stood in stark contrast to the warmth that had steadily grown within the walls of the great house itself. The legal matter regarding Margaret's late husband's estate had finally reached its conclusion, the solicitor's diligent work uncovering enough evidence of fraudulent dealing on the part of Edmund's cousin to overturn the original claim entirely. Margaret found herself, for the first time since her husband's death, in possession of the modest but meaningful inheritance that had always rightfully belonged to her. The victory, though welcome, meant less to Margaret than the steady presence of the people who had helped her achieve it. She no longer needed the shelter of Blackthorn Hall out of desperate necessity, a fact that Alaric acknowledged one evening as they sat together by the familiar fire in the small sitting room that had become, over the preceding months, something of a sanctuary for them both. "You are, of course, free to establish your own household now, should you wish it," Alaric said carefully, watching her expression closely as he spoke. "The inheritance secured through the solicitor's efforts would provide you a comfortable, independent life, should that be what you desire." Margaret studied him for a long moment, understanding the weight beneath his carefully measured words, the question he was not quite asking directly. "Is that what you wish for me?" she asked. "An independent life, separate from this house, separate from you." "No," Alaric said, his composure slipping slightly to reveal the earnestness beneath it. "That is very much not what I wish, Margaret. I have spent these past months coming to understand that my life holds far less meaning without your presence woven through it. I only wish to ensure that whatever choice you make moving forward, you make it freely, not out of any obligation or dependency, but out of genuine desire." Margaret felt her heart swell with the tenderness of his consideration, the care he had taken, throughout their entire courtship, to honor her autonomy and her healing, rather than pressing his own desires upon her before she was ready to embrace them fully. "I have given this a great deal of thought," she said softly, "and I find that my desire, freely and fully chosen, is to remain here, not out of necessity but because this house and the people within it have become something I did not expect to find again after everything I lost. A home, a family, a future I can look forward to rather than simply endure." Alaric rose from his chair and crossed to kneel before her, taking both her hands gently in his own, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer attempted to hide. "Margaret Ashworth," he said, his voice steady despite the evident depth of feeling behind his words, "I have loved carefully and cautiously my entire life, always wary of the obligations and expectations that come with my position, always uncertain whether genuine connection was something I would ever truly find. And then you arrived, grieving and wronged and utterly unwilling to let either circumstance diminish your quiet strength, and everything I believed about love and connection changed entirely. I do not wish to spend another day pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than complete devotion. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled freely down Margaret's cheeks now, though these carried nothing but joy within them, a feeling so foreign to her after months of grief that it took her a moment to fully recognize it for what it was. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alaric, I will marry you gladly, and with a heart more full than I ever believed possible after everything I have endured." Alaric rose and drew her into his arms, the embrace carrying all the tenderness and relief of two people who had each, in their own ways, feared they might never find genuine happiness again, only to discover it unexpectedly in each other's company. When they finally parted, both smiling through the lingering traces of joyful tears, Alaric reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small ring, its design elegant but understated, clearly chosen with careful thought rather than mere ostentation. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, slipping the ring gently onto her finger. "She was, by all accounts, a woman of remarkable strength and quiet dignity, much like yourself. I believe she would be pleased to know it has found its way to you." The wedding took place in early spring, when the grounds of Blackthorn Hall had begun to bloom once more with the fresh colors of the new season, a fitting backdrop for the new chapter Margaret and Alaric were beginning together. The ceremony was modest by the standards typically expected of a duke's wedding, held in the small chapel on the estate grounds, rather than the grand cathedral society might have anticipated. A choice both Margaret and Alaric had made deliberately, wishing for an occasion that reflected the genuine intimacy of their connection rather than the empty grandeur so often expected of their station. Constance stood beside her brother throughout the ceremony, her expression carrying none of the coldness that had once defined her demeanor, replaced instead by genuine warmth, and Margaret noted with quiet satisfaction, something that looked remarkably like happiness for the two people whose lives had become so intertwined with her own. In the months since their difficult confrontation, Constance had continued her efforts toward genuine healing, eventually seeking the support of a trusted confidant beyond the walls of Blackthorn Hall, a decision that had visibly softened the hard edges she had carried for so many years. Grace, too, stood among the small gathering of household staff invited to witness the ceremony, her earlier fear entirely replaced by genuine joy for the woman whose kindness had, in its own quiet way, helped set right the wrongs she had once been too frightened to speak against. Eleanor stood beside her, beaming with the particular pride of someone who had offered small kindnesses during Margaret's darkest days and now found herself witness to the joy that had eventually followed. As Margaret exchanged her vows with Alaric beneath the soft spring sunlight filtering through the chapel's stained glass windows, she found her thoughts drifting, as they often did during moments of significant emotion, to her daughter, Sophia, and to Edmund, the husband whose memory she still carried with tender affection despite the new love that had grown within her heart. She did not believe that this new happiness diminished the love she had shared with them, but rather that it honored the resilience they had helped shape within her, the strength that had allowed her to survive such profound loss and still find herself capable, in time, of embracing joy once more. That evening, after the modest celebration had concluded and the guests had departed, Margaret found herself alone in what was now, officially, her own chambers within Blackthorn Hall, unpacking the small trunk that had once contained everything she owned in the world when she first arrived at these gates as a desperate, grieving widow with nowhere else to turn. She withdrew the small, wrapped portrait of Sophia, the same one she had clutched so tightly during that terrible night in the cellar, and carried it to the mantel above the fireplace, setting it gently in a place of honor where she would see it each morning and evening from this day forward. Alaric found her there a short while later, watching quietly from the doorway as she arranged the small portrait, understanding instinctively the significance of the moment without need for explanation. "She would be proud of you," he said softly, crossing the room to stand beside her. "Whatever pain led you here, I believe she would be proud of the strength you have shown, and grateful, I think, that you have found happiness again." Margaret leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from the steady warmth of his presence, from the genuine understanding he had shown, again and again, for the complicated layers of grief and hope that continued to coexist within her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making space for her memory alongside everything we are building together. Not everyone would understand that need." "She is a part of you," Alaric said simply. "And I love every part of you, Margaret. Her memory is not a burden to be tolerated. It is a piece of the woman I have come to cherish so deeply." They stood together for a long while in comfortable silence, watching the last light of their wedding day fade beyond the windows of Blackthorn Hall, the small portrait of a daughter lost too soon standing quiet witness to a new beginning neither Margaret nor Alaric had dared to hope for, not so very long ago, when a cruel command and a locked cellar door had first, unexpectedly, brought them together. In the months that followed, Blackthorn Hall continued to transform, not merely in the physical sense, though Margaret did bring her own gentle touches to the household's decoration and daily rhythms, but in the deeper, more meaningful sense of a house finally becoming, in the truest sense of the word, a home. Constance's relationship with both her brother and her new sister continued to deepen and heal, the three of them gradually building the kind of genuine familial warmth that had eluded their household for so many years under their father's demanding, distant influence. Margaret never forgot the kindness of those who had stood by her during her darkest days at Blackthorn Hall, Eleanor's quiet comfort, Grace's eventual courage, Mrs. Whitfield's steady support, and she made certain, in her new position within the household, that such loyalty and integrity among the staff was recognized and valued as it deserved to be. The household that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming to a grieving, desperate widow became, under her gentle influence, a place known throughout the region for its warmth and genuine care for all who resided within its walls, whether by birth, by marriage, or by service. As for the small portrait of Sophia, it remained always in its place of honor above the mantel in Margaret's chambers, a permanent reminder of the daughter whose brief life had shaped her mother into a woman capable of surviving unimaginable loss and still, against every reasonable expectation, finding her way back to genuine happiness. Margaret often thought, in quiet moments of reflection, that her daughter's memory had, in its own small way, guided her toward this new life, that the fierce, protective love she had carried for that small painted portrait through her darkest hour had somehow paved the way toward the deeper love she had since found with Alaric. The cruel command that had once sent her into the cold darkness of the cellar had, against every reasonable expectation, become the very moment that changed the entire course of her life, leading her not toward further suffering, but toward a duke whose compassion and integrity had shown her, when she needed it most, that kindness and justice still existed in a world that had given her so much reason to doubt it. And in the quiet, contented years that followed, Margaret never once regretted the winding, painful path that had ultimately led her home. 2 years passed at Blackthorn Hall, each season bringing its own quiet milestones to the household that had once been shadowed by suspicion and cold formality. Margaret settled fully into her role as Duchess, though she never lost the humility that had first drawn Alaric to her, continuing to walk the eastern gardens each morning regardless of the weather, a habit that had carried her through her darkest days and now simply brought her peace. It was during the second spring of their marriage that Margaret discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled the entire household with a joy tempered, for Margaret herself, by an old, familiar fear she could not entirely shake. She confided this fear to Alaric one evening, her hand resting protectively over the small swell of her stomach. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly. "I have loved a child before and lost her. I do not know if my heart can survive such a loss twice." Alaric drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Your heart is stronger than you give it credit for," he said, "and whatever comes, you will not face it alone, not this time." The child, a daughter, arrived on a crisp autumn morning, healthy and strong, her cries filling the halls of Blackthorn Hall with a sound Margaret had feared she might never hear again in her own home. They named her Grace, in quiet honor of the young maid whose courage had once helped uncover the truth that brought Margaret and Alaric together, a gesture that moved the household's Grace to tears when she learned of it. Constance, who had continued her own journey toward healing in the years since her confrontation with her brother, became a devoted aunt to the child, often found in the nursery reading softly to her niece, or walking her through the gardens Margaret loved so dearly. The bitterness that had once defined Constance had, by then, largely given way to a woman capable of genuine warmth, though she never fully lost the sharp wit that had always been a part of her character, tempered now into something kinder, used more often to bring laughter than pain. Margaret kept Sophia's portrait always in its place above the mantel, and as young Grace grew old enough to ask questions, Margaret told her, gently and honestly, about the sister who had lived before her, a small ghost of grief woven carefully into the fabric of their family story rather than hidden away as something shameful or too painful to acknowledge. Alaric watched with quiet pride as his wife taught their daughter that love did not require forgetting, that grief and joy could coexist within the same tender heart. The story of the widow locked in the cellar, and the duke who found her holding a portrait of her lost daughter, became, over the years, something of a quiet legend among the household staff, passed down and retold with the kind of warmth reserved for stories that remind people what genuine kindness and justice can accomplish, even in the darkest of circumstances. Eleanor, who eventually rose to the position of head housekeeper following Mrs. Whitfield's retirement, often told the story to new staff members joining the household, always ending with the same simple observation. "The Duke did not simply find a woman that night," she would say. "He found the truth, and in doing so, he found a family he never knew he was missing." Margaret and Alaric's marriage continued to deepen with each passing year, built not on the fleeting foundations of wealth or station, but on the genuine respect and understanding that had first drawn them together in the unlikeliest of circumstances. They faced future challenges together, as all marriages inevitably do: disagreements over household matters, the ordinary worries of raising a child, the occasional resurfacing of old griefs that never fully disappear but simply learn to coexist alongside new joys. Through it all, they remained steady partners to one another, the trust forged during those early, difficult weeks proving strong enough to weather whatever came after. Constance eventually found her own path toward happiness as well, though it took longer for her than for her brother, the wounds of her past requiring more careful, patient healing. In the 4th year following Margaret's arrival, she formed a genuine connection with a widowed gentleman of quiet, steady character, a man who reminded her, in the best possible ways, that not every promise of affection ended in betrayal. Their eventual marriage was modest and joyful, and Margaret stood beside her sister by marriage on that day with genuine happiness, remembering how far they had both traveled from the cold, suspicious first meeting that had once defined their relationship. Blackthorn Hall itself seemed to reflect the transformation of the family within its walls, its once formal, distant atmosphere gradually replaced by the warm, lived-in feeling of a true family home. Margaret often thought back to that first terrifying night in the cellar, to the darkness and fear that had once threatened to overwhelm her, and marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed since that moment. She never forgot the pain of those early days, never pretended the cruelty she had endured had not left its own quiet marks upon her. But she came to understand, with the wisdom that only time and healing can bring, that even the darkest chapters of a story can lead, eventually, toward genuine light. On quiet evenings, long after young Grace had been tucked into bed, and the household had settled into its peaceful nighttime rhythm, Margaret and Alaric often found themselves back in the same small sitting room where their friendship had first begun, the fire crackling softly between them just as it had on that very first night. They rarely spoke of the cellar anymore, the memory having softened over the years into something distant and almost unreal. But every so often, on nights when the wind howled particularly fiercely against the windows, Alaric would reach for her hand and offer the same quiet words he had first spoken to her in that dim, candle-lit sitting room so many years before. "I am glad I came home when I did," he would say, and Margaret would smile, understanding the full weight of gratitude behind such simple words, for she carried that same gratitude within her own heart every single day. Their daughter grew into a bright, curious child, inheriting her mother's quiet strength and her father's steady compassion in equal measure. And as the years continued to unfold at Blackthorn Hall, the family that had been forged through such unlikely and painful circumstances flourished into something neither Margaret nor Alaric could have imagined possible on that first, terrible night, when a cruel command had sent an innocent widow into the cold darkness of a cellar, only for a duke to find her there, holding tightly to the memory of a love she had feared the world might never let her honor again. In the end, it was not the missing brooch, nor the cruelty that had briefly threatened to define her time at Blackthorn Hall, that Margaret remembered most clearly when she looked back on those early days. It was the moment the cellar door had opened, and a stranger's lantern light had fallen upon her, and a kind, steady voice had asked her, with genuine concern rather than suspicion, about the small portrait she held so tightly against her heart. That single moment of unexpected compassion had changed the entire course of her life, transforming unbearable grief into the foundation of a love and a family she would treasure for the rest of her days.